On a rain-slicked street in downtown Chicago, a scene of casual cruelty is about to become a turning point for an entire police department. James Cooper, a 65-year-old former motorcycle mechanic, sits handcuffed in the back of a patrol car, his vintage Harley Davidson gleaming under the streetlights. The officers who arrested him are laughing, high-fiving each other as they plant evidence in his saddlebags. They see him as just another aging biker, an easy target for their weekly quota. What they don't know is that their bodycam footage is already being uploaded to the department's central server, where it will soon reach the desk of their newly appointed chief of police. Michael Cooper didn't spend 15 years climbing the ranks of law enforcement to watch his own father become a victim of the very system he now commands. For these corrupt officers, their morning of power abuse is about to become the catalyst for their worst nightmare. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The bell above Cooper's vintage motorcycles chimed, as it had for the past 30 years. James Cooper's weathered hands moved steadily over the engine of a '72 Triumph, his fingers finding their way through the mechanical maze with practiced precision. The shop smelled of metal and motor oil, mixing with the aroma of fresh coffee from the pot he kept brewing for his regulars. "Morning, Mr. Cooper." Tommy Martinez, a local high school teacher, called out as he entered. The teenager trailing behind him clutched a damaged helmet, eyes downcast. "Got a situation here I thought you might help with." James wiped his hands on a red shop rag and straightened up, his back protesting slightly. At 65, he wasn't as spry as he used to be, but his mind was sharp as ever. "What have we got?" "My son crashed his bike," Tommy explained. "Nothing serious, but the helmet took a hit. I want him to understand why we always wear proper gear." James nodded, taking the helmet. He'd seen too many riders who hadn't been so lucky. "Good call, Tommy. Come here, young man." He gestured to the wall behind his workbench, covered in photographs. "See these? Every one of them tells a story about why we respect our machines and protect ourselves." The wall was his pride and joy. Decades of Chicago's motorcycle history captured in fading Polaroids and digital prints. Charity runs, community events, safety workshops. In many, James stood with his son Michael, from toddler to teenager to proud police academy graduate. "Been riding since before your dad was born," James continued, pointing to a photo of himself, astride a restored Indian chief. "Started this shop because I believed in doing things right. Motorcycles aren't just machines, they're freedom, responsibility, and community all rolled into one." The shop was more than just a business. It was a sanctuary for riders of all stripes. Weekend warriors, daily commuters, and yes, even a few cops who appreciated honest work and straight talk. James had built a reputation for fair prices and fatherly advice, especially for young riders learning the ropes. His phone buzzed. Another text from Michael. "Dad, monthly dinner still on for Friday?" James smiled, typing back a quick confirmation. Their relationship had grown stronger since Sarah, James's wife and Michael's mother, passed 5 years ago. Through the grief, they'd found a deeper understanding of each other. The afternoon light streamed through the shop's windows, catching on the chrome of dozens of bikes in various stages of repair. Each one had a story, just like the riders who brought them in. James moved between them, adjusting a carburetor here, checking brake lines there, sharing wisdom with anyone who asked. "Your son's doing great work at the department," Officer Hayes mentioned during his usual coffee stop. "Youngest chief we've ever had." James beamed with pride, though lately he'd noticed tension in Hayes's voice when discussing the department. Something was changing there, and not everyone was happy about it. Michael had hinted at reforms he planned to implement, cleaning up practices that had gone unchecked for too long. As closing time approached, James wheeled his own Harley out front, a '89 Softail he'd restored himself, gleaming black with subtle blue pinstripes. It was his daily reminder of why he loved this life. the perfect blend of mechanical precision and artistic soul. The sun was setting as he locked up, casting long shadows down the street. A patrol car cruised by slowly, and James noticed the officers inside watching him with unusual interest. He'd been seeing more police presence lately, ever since Michael started his new position. Some seemed friendly, others not so much. Thunder rumbled in the distance as he mounted his bike. Chicago's weather was turning, but he'd ridden through worse. Besides, home was just a few miles away, and he had some paperwork to finish before tomorrow's safety demonstration at the local high school. What James didn't know, as he pulled away from his shop, was that this would be the last normal day he'd have for quite some time. The wheels of corruption were already turning against him, set in motion by those who saw his son as a threat to their comfortable arrangement with power. The old biker gunned his engine, merging smoothly into traffic. 30 years of honest business, community service, and mentoring riders had earned him respect throughout Chicago's motorcycle scene. But to some, he was about to become nothing more than a pawn in a dangerous game of power and revenge. Michael Cooper stood at the window of his new office, the gold nameplate on his desk still gleaming with unfamiliar authority. Chief Michael Cooper. At 38, he was the youngest police chief in Chicago PD's history, and the weight of that responsibility pressed down on his shoulders like a bulletproof vest. The early morning sun cast long shadows across his desk, where 3 personnel files lay open. Each contained complaint reports he'd been reviewing: excessive force, wrongful arrests, missing evidence. The same names kept appearing: Officers Reeves, Martinez, and Sullivan. Their supervisor, Lieutenant Brady, had dismissed every complaint, with the same rubber stamp explanation: insufficient evidence. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, turning to face Detective Sarah Chen, one of the few officers he trusted completely. "Morning, Chief," she said, carrying a fresh stack of reports. "You wanted to see the bodycam audit from last month?" Michael nodded, clearing space on his desk. "What did you find?" "It's worse than we thought," Chen replied, spreading out several documents. 23 instances of cameras being conveniently malfunctioning during arrests, all clustered around specific officers and shifts. He studied the patterns she'd highlighted, his jaw tightening. The same names. Always the same names. "And Brady?" "Signs off on everything. But here's the interesting part." Chen leaned closer, lowering her voice. "I tracked the missing evidence cases. Most of them involve high-value seizures, cash, drugs, expensive vehicles. The paperwork shows smaller amounts than what witnesses reported." Michael ran a hand through his dark hair, peppered with early gray at the temples. 15 years in law enforcement had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now they were screaming that this went deeper than a few corrupt officers. His phone buzzed, a text from his father about their Friday dinner plans. Michael smiled briefly, remembering the lessons James had taught him about integrity. "Do it right or don't do it at all," he'd say, whether they were rebuilding a motorcycle engine or discussing Michael's career choices. "Keep digging," he told Chen, but quietly. "If this is as big as I think it is, we need to be careful." After she left, Michael reviewed the reform proposals he'd been drafting. Mandatory body cam reviews, rotating partner assignments, enhanced oversight of evidence. Handling, each measure designed to shine light into the department's darkest corners. The resistance had started almost immediately after his appointment. Subtle at first, whispered conversations that stopped when he entered rooms, paperwork that took longer than usual to process, small but irritating obstacles in his daily operations. Lieutenant Brady appeared in his doorway, a false smile plastered on his face. "Chief, got a minute?" "Come in, Jack." Michael gestured to a chair, noting how Brady's eyes flickered over the open files on his desk. "The union reps are concerned about some of your proposed changes," Brady began, his tone carefully neutral. "Especially the body cam reviews. Officers feel it shows a lack of trust." Michael met his gaze steadily. Trust is earned, Lieutenant, through accountability and transparency. We have procedures in place. Procedures that haven't been updated. In 15 years, Michael cut in. Times change. We change with them. Brady's smile tightened. You're still new to this position, Chief. There are traditions, ways of doing things that have served this department well. Served who well? Jack? Michael asked quietly. The tension in the room could have been cut with a knife. Brady stood slowly, his friendly facade cracking slightly. Just consider the broader implications of these changes. Not everyone appreciates having their boat rocked. After Brady left, Michael pulled up the department's organization chart on his computer. Names and positions connected by lines of authority, but he knew the real power structure wasn't so neat and official. Somewhere in this web of relationships lay the truth he needed to uncover. His assistant buzzed through. Chief, Commissioner. Wallace's office called. He wants to meet about the budget proposals. Schedule it for tomorrow, Michael replied, already suspecting what that conversation would entail. Wallace had been commissioner for 12 years, overseeing the very system Michael was now trying to reform. The afternoon brought a parade of meetings, community outreach programs, patrol schedules, training updates. But his mind kept returning to those personnel files, the pattern of complaints, the missing evidence. As darkness fell over Chicago, Michael finally packed up to head home. A framed photo on his desk caught his eye, him and his father at his academy graduation, both beaming with pride. James Cooper had taught him that real strength wasn't about power or authority, but about doing what was right, especially when it was hard. Walking to his car, Michael noticed Officer Reeves watching from across the parking lot, phone to his ear. The message was clear. He was being watched too. Good, he thought, starting his engine. Let them watch, let them worry. Because Michael Cooper hadn't spent 15 years climbing the ranks to maintain the status quo. He'd done it to make a difference, to clean up a system that had lost its way. What he didn't know yet was how personal this fight was about to become, or that his father would soon be caught in the crossfire of a war that had been brewing long before he took the chief's office. The first drops of rain began to fall as James Cooper headed home on his Harley. The weather matched his mood. Something felt off about the patrol car that had been trailing him for the last 10 minutes. He'd done nothing wrong, maintaining perfect speed, signaling every turn. But they stayed with him just far enough back to avoid being obvious. His suspicions were confirmed when red and blue lights suddenly flooded his mirrors. James sighed, carefully signaling and pulling over to the curb. The patrol car stopped behind him, its high beams nearly blinding in his mirrors. 2 officers emerged, approaching with hands resting on their weapons, an unnecessary show of force that sent a clear message. License and registration, Officer Reeves demanded, flashlight beam deliberately aimed at James's eyes. Behind him, Officer Sullivan circled the Harley, his demeanor predatory. Of course, James replied calmly, reaching slowly for his wallet. 30 years of riding had taught him how to handle police stops. Stay calm, move deliberately, keep your ends visible. You know why we stopped you? Reeves asked, studying James's license with exaggerated care. No, sir, I don't. I was following all traffic laws. Sullivan's voice came from behind. Bike matches a description. Recent drug trafficking. In the area. James's heart rate picked up, but he kept his voice steady. This is my personal bike. I own Cooper's vintage motorcycles on 5th Street. You're welcome to check. Step off the motorcycle. Reeves cut him off. Hands where we can see them. The rain was falling harder now as James carefully dismounted. He knew arguing would only make things worse, but something about their attitudes told him this wasn't a routine stop. Spread your legs, hands on the bike, Sullivan ordered, moving in to pat him down with unnecessary roughness. Watch it, James protested as the officer slammed him harder against his own motorcycle. Resisting? Reeves asked, his tone almost hopeful. No, sir, just asking for professional courtesy. Sullivan's pat-down turned into a deliberate attempt to provoke, fingers digging into pressure points. Well, what do we have here? he announced, pulling something from James's saddlebag. Something James knew hadn't been there before. "That's not mine," James stated firmly, watching in disbelief as Sullivan held up a small bag of white powder. "You just planted that." "Looks like cocaine to me," Reeves said, smirking. "And what's this?" He reached into another compartment, producing a small revolver that James had definitely never seen before. "This is ridiculous," James protested. "Those aren't my—" The rest of his sentence was cut off as Sullivan grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back. The handcuffs snapped closed with deliberate tightness. "James Cooper, you're under arrest for possession of narcotics and an unlicensed firearm," Reeves recited, clearly enjoying himself. "You have the right to remain silent." Rain soaked through James's jacket as they made a show of searching his bike, finding more evidence he knew they'd planted. His mind raced. This was no random harassment. This was targeted, planned. "My son," he began. "Oh, we know all about your son," Sullivan interrupted, shoving him toward the patrol car. "The high and mighty new chief. Maybe this will teach him something about respecting the old ways of doing things." They pushed him into the back seat, neither bothering to protect his head from the doorframe. James winced as it made contact, already feeling a bruise forming. "What about my bike?" he asked, watching rain pour down on his beloved Harley. "We'll have it impounded," Reeves answered, climbing into the driver's seat. "Evidence in a drug trafficking investigation now." Through the rain-streaked windows, James watched his motorcycle recede into the distance as they drove away. His shoulders ached from the tight cuffs, but it was nothing compared to the anger building in his chest. They'd targeted him to get to Michael, using a father to send a message to his son. At the station, they made a show of booking him, taking their time with fingerprints and photographs. Other officers watched, some uncomfortable, others clearly in on the game. James recognized Lieutenant Brady supervising from his office doorway, poorly concealing his satisfaction. "Cell 3, Brady called out. "Make sure he's comfortable." The holding cell was cold and smelled of disinfectant and despair. James sat on the metal bench, his mind working through options. He knew Michael would find out soon. The question was how much damage these corrupt officers planned to do before that happened. A young officer James didn't recognize brought him water, whispering quickly, "Chief Cooper's out at a community. A meeting, won't be back for hours." So that was their plan. Grab him when Michael wasn't around, let the system grind away at him for a while. Show the new chief that he wasn't as in control as he thought. From his cell, James could hear Reeves and Sullivan laughing, probably filling out their report with more fabricated details. Their bodycams were conspicuously off, standard procedure for dirty cops. What they didn't know was that James Cooper hadn't survived 40 years in Chicago's motorcycle community by being naive. He'd seen corruption before, watched it destroy good people and good institutions. But he'd also taught his son everything he knew about standing up to bullies and fighting for what was right. These officers thought they were teaching Michael a lesson. Instead, they were about to learn one themselves, about the bond between father and son, about the strength of integrity, and about the price of abusing power. James settled back against the cold cell wall, ignoring the discomfort of his shoulders. Let them laugh, let them think they'd won. The storm they'd just unleashed would wash away more than just tonight's rain. Dispatch Officer Jenny Martinez's fingers froze over her keyboard as she processed the arrest report. James Cooper. The name hit her like a punch to the gut. She'd bought her first motorcycle from his shop, and he'd spent an hour teaching her basic maintenance, free of charge. More importantly, she knew exactly whose father he was. "Hey, you okay?" her colleague Dave asked, noticing her hesitation. "Just processed an arrest. James Cooper." She watched Dave's eyes widen in recognition. "Yeah, the chief's father." The news spread through the department like wildfire, moving in whispers and hasty text messages. Officer Hayes, who regularly stopped at Cooper's shop for coffee, overheard Sullivan bragging in the break room. "Should have seen his face when we found the drugs." Sullivan laughed, making air quotes. Bet the chief thinks twice about those. Bodycam reviews now. Hayes slipped away, feeling sick. He'd known things were bad, but this was crossing a line he couldn't ignore. His hand hovered over his phone, Chief Cooper's number ready to dial. But Brady was watching everyone closely, marking who sided where. In the evidence room, technician Marcus Williams logged in the items from James's arrest. His trained eye caught the inconsistencies immediately. The clean, unhandled state of the discovered gun, the suspicious weight of the drug package. He carefully documented everything, knowing these details would matter later. Need you to rush this processing. Lieutenant Brady appeared in the doorway, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request. Make sure everything's properly recorded. As found on scene. Yes, sir, Marcus replied neutrally, continuing his meticulous notes. 15 years in evidence processing had taught him to always create a paper trail. Something told him this one would be particularly important. The holding cells were unusually busy with officers walking past, stealing glances at James Cooper. Some looked ashamed, others triumphant. Word had reached the night shift teams coming. In and battle lines were already being drawn. Detective Chen received 3 different anonymous tips about the arrest within an hour. She watched the surveillance feeds, noting which officers clustered together, who made calls, who seemed nervous. This wasn't just an arrest. It was a declaration of war. In the parking lot, Reeves and Sullivan huddled with Brady, their conversation heated despite attempts to look casual. The body cams, Reeves started. Taken care of, Brady assured them. Technical malfunction. Happens all the time. What they didn't know was that the department's new automated upload system, implemented just last week on Chief Cooper's orders, had already backed up their footage to a secure server. Their attempted deletion would only add another log entry to the growing evidence of corruption. By the time darkness fell, the department had effectively split into 2 camps, those who supported the old guard and their traditional methods, and those who saw this arrest as the tipping point they'd been waiting for. The question on everyone's mind, where was Chief Cooper and what would happen when he found out? Michael Cooper's community meeting had run late, discussions about neighborhood policing initiatives stretching well into the evening. As he walked through the station's back entrance, he noticed an unusual tension in the air. Officers avoided. His gaze, conversations died as he passed, and an uncomfortable silence followed in his wake. Detective Chen intercepted him before he reached his office. "Chief, we need to talk. Now." Her tone made him stop. Sarah Chen never showed urgency unless something was seriously wrong. What happened? "Not here," she said quietly, gesturing toward his office. Once inside, Chen closed the door and pulled up the evening's arrest records on his computer. Michael's world tilted as he saw the booking photo. His father's face, proud even in the harsh fluorescent light. "When?" His voice was deadly quiet. "2 hours ago. Reeves and Sullivan made the arrest. They're claiming they found drugs and an unregistered firearm." Chen watched his face carefully. Brady supervised the booking personally. Michael's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white. The pieces clicked into place. His father's arrest, the timing, Brady's involvement. This wasn't law enforcement. This was a message. The body cameras? They reported technical malfunctions, but Chen smiled grimly, pulling up another screen. "Your new automated upload system worked perfectly. We have complete footage from both officers, uploaded in real time during the arrest." Michael started the video, watching his father being pulled over, the officer's aggressive approach, the obviously planted evidence. Each moment of disrespect, each violation of procedure, each abuse of power fed the cold fury building in his chest. Where is he now? Cell 3, Brady's orders. Michael stood, but Chen caught his arm. "Wait, you need to see this too." She pulled up the evidence log. Marcus in processing documented everything. The gun's never been fired completely. "Clean. The drug package weight doesn't match the report. He's building you an ironclad case of evidence tampering." "They're not just corrupt," Michael said, pieces falling into place. "They're stupid. They did this to send a message, but they just handed me everything I need to tear them down." A knock at the door made them both turn. Officer Hayes entered, looking nervous but determined. "Chief, you need to hear what Sullivan was saying in the break room. I recorded it." He held up his phone. "They're not even trying to hide what they did." Michael listened to Sullivan's boasting, each word another nail in the corrupt officers' coffins. "Get me everything, every report, every video, every witness statement. I want this by the book, so clean they can't wiggle out on a technicality." "Already on it," Chen confirmed. "We've got at least 6 officers ready to testify about what they saw and heard." Michael checked his watch. 3 hours since the arrest. 3 hours they'd kept his father in a cell to prove a point. His voice was ice when he spoke again. "Chen, start the paperwork. Hayes, get me the duty roster for the next week. I want to know everyone who was involved in this. I'm going to see my father." He strode through the station, his presence now commanding immediate attention. Officers scrambled out of his way, the weight of his authority and anger filling the corridors. Through the holding area window, he saw Brady smirking, clearly waiting to witness his reaction. Let them watch, Michael thought. Let them see exactly what happens when you push a good man too far. They thought they were teaching him a lesson about power. Instead, they were about to learn one about justice. His father looked up as he approached the cell, their eyes meeting in a moment of shared understanding. No words were needed. They both knew this was more than just an arrest. This was the spark that would finally burn away the corruption poisoning the department. "I'm getting you out," Michael said simply. James Cooper nodded, his dignity intact despite the circumstances. "I know, son. Just make it count." Michael's jaw tightened as he turned to the holding cell officer. "Release him now," his voice carried. Through the station, marking the moment everything changed. "And get me Officer Reeves and Sullivan's badges on my desk. They're going to learn what real law enforcement looks like." Dawn broke over Chicago as Michael Cooper assembled his trusted team in the conference room. Detective Chen, Officer Hayes, Marcus Williams from Evidence, and 3 hand-picked internal affairs investigators sat around the table, each with stacks of files before them. The room hummed with purpose. They all knew this was the moment they'd been waiting for. "What we're about to do," Michael began, standing at the head of the table, "isn't just about my father. It's about every citizen who's been wrongfully arrested, every piece of evidence that's mysteriously disappeared, every complaint that's been buried. We're going to clean house, and we're going to do it right." Chen spread out a network diagram she'd created overnight. "These are the key players we've identified so far. Reeves and Sullivan are the muscle, but they're just the surface. Brady's their direct supervisor, and he's connected to at least 6 other officers involved in similar incidents." Marcus slid forward his evidence reports. "I've documented 37 cases in the past year alone where seized evidence amounts didn't match initial field reports. Always the same officers, always the same types of discrepancies. Money and drugs," Hayes added, pointing to specific cases. "High-value items that are easy to move. I've been tracking their patrol patterns too. They focus on specific neighborhoods, specific times. It's coordinated." Michael studied the patterns emerging on the conference room wall where they'd mapped everything out. Red strings connected photos, reports, and locations, creating a web of corruption that stretched back years. "What about the bodycam footage from last night?" one of the IA investigators asked. "Archived and secured," Chen confirmed. "Multiple copies, offline storage. They tried to delete it, but the new system caught them. We have their deletion attempts. Log 2 adds tampering with evidence to their charges." The team worked through the morning, building their case methodically. Each officer's history was scrutinized, each complaint re-examined, each pattern documented. More officers came forward as word spread, bringing their own pieces of the puzzle. "Chief," a young officer interrupted, knocking on the conference room door. You need to see this. Brady's calling an emergency union meeting for this afternoon. Michael nodded grimly. They're circling the wagons. Good. Let them meet. Hayes, make sure we have eyes and ears in that room. Already arranged, Hayes confirmed. 3 officers we trust will be there. The investigation expanded beyond just the previous night's arrest. They uncovered a system of organized corruption, traffic stops coordinated to seize assets, evidence disappearing from lockup, complaints vanishing from files. The pattern was clear. This wasn't just a few bad officers. It was an organized operation. Look at these property seizure records, one of the IA investigators noted. Over $2 million in assets seized last year alone, but only 60% made it into official evidence. Follow the money, Michael ordered. Chen, get me warrant request ready. I want their financials, their communications, everything. Marcus, secure the evidence room. No one goes in or out without documentation and supervision. As the day progressed, support grew. Officers who'd stayed quiet out of fear began coming forward, sharing stories of what they'd witnessed. Each new piece of testimony strengthened their case. We're not just building a case against a few officers, Michael told his team as they reviewed their progress. We're exposing a culture of corruption. When we move on all of it. The evidence wall had grown, the web of connections now covering nearly the entire surface. At its center was Lieutenant Brady's photo, connected to dozens of incidents, complaints, and suspicious activities. What's our timeline? Chen asked, adding another red string to the wall. Michael checked his watch, thinking of his father, who was now safely at home but angry and determined to help. We gather evidence through the week, document everything, build our case until it's ironclad. Then we take it all down at once. No warnings, no leaks, no escape routes. The team nodded, understanding the stakes. This wasn't just about justice. It was about transforming the entire department. The corrupt officers had thought targeting James Cooper would shut down reform efforts. Instead, they'd just given Michael everything he needed to tear their whole system apart. As the sun set, Michael stood alone in the conference room, studying the evidence wall. Tomorrow, Brady and his crew would start their pushback, thinking they still held power. They had no idea what was coming, no idea that their act of revenge had just signed their own professional death warrants. Get some rest, he told his team as they wrapped up. Tomorrow, we start taking back our department. The financial records painted a damning picture. Detective Chen spread them across Michael's desk, each document adding another layer to their investigation. Bank statements, property records, and shell company registrations formed a maze of corruption that stretched far beyond the department. They're smarter than we thought, Chen said, pointing to a series of transactions. Brady's been moving money through a network of private security companies, each one registered to relatives or friends of officers in the corrupt ring. The seized assets go in as consulting fees and come out clean. Michael studied the pattern, his expression hardening. How many companies? 12 so far. But here's where it gets interesting. She pulled out property records. These companies all provide security for nightclubs and bars owned by James Morton. Morton? Michael's head snapped up. The police commissioner's brother-in-law? The same. And guess who sits on the licensing board that approves these establishments? Chen slid another document forward. Lieutenant Brady's wife. The pieces were falling into place. This wasn't just street-level corruption. It was an organized enterprise, reaching into city government. The corrupt officers weren't just stealing evidence. They were providing muscle for a larger protection racket. Officer Hayes burst into the office, his face flushed with excitement. "Chief, you need to hear this." He placed his phone on the desk, playing a recording from the union meeting. Brady's voice filled the room. "Morton's asking questions about Cooper's kid. Says the commissioner's worried about where these investigations might lead. We need to shut this down fast." Michael's jaw tightened. "They're scared." "Good. What else?" "Morton's establishments have been operating after hours, running illegal gambling operations. The corrupt officers provide protection and handle any problems that arise. They've been using their badges to intimidate competitors and silence complaints. A knock at the door interrupted them. Marcus from Evidence entered, carrying a thick file. Remember those missing drug seizures? I traced the paper trail. The drugs aren't disappearing. They're being logged as destroyed, but the destruction records are being falsified. They're using Morton's clubs to distribute. Michael stood, walking to his window. The corruption wasn't just about money. It was about power. Brady and his officers were just one part of a larger criminal enterprise, using their badges to protect and expand Morton's illegal operations. The commissioner has to know, Chen said quietly. These operations couldn't run without protection from the top. And now we know why they targeted my father, Michael replied. They're not just sending me a message, they're protecting their entire operation. He turned back to his team. What about the other officers? How many are involved? Hayes consulted. His notes. We've identified 28 officers directly involved in providing protection or handling evidence. Another dozen are probably taking payoffs to look the other way. But here's something interesting, Chen added. Some of Morton's employees have been talking. They're tired of the shakedowns, tired of Brady's crew throwing their weight around. 3 have agreed to testify about police involvement in the gambling operations. Michael absorbed this information, his mind already forming a plan. The corrupt officers had overplayed their hand. By targeting his father, they'd exposed their entire operation to someone with the power and motivation to tear it all down. Morton's the key, he said finally. He connects everything, the corrupt officers, the illegal operations, the commissioner. We take him down. We take them all down. It won't be easy, Chen warned. These people have serious political connections. Michael smiled grimly. They also have enemies. Hayes, get me everything you can on Morton's competitors, the businesses that have been muscled out or shut down. Chen, keep following the money. Marcus, I want a complete audit of every case these officers have touched. We're not just building a case against dirty cops anymore. We're going after organized crime wearing badges. As his team left to continue their work, Michael picked up his father's booking photo from his desk. What had started as an act of revenge against reform had cracked open something much bigger. Brady and his crew thought they were untouchable, protected by their connections to Morton and the commissioner. They were about to learn otherwise. Michael Cooper hadn't become the youngest police chief in Chicago's history by playing it safe. He'd done it by being smarter, working harder, and never backing down from a fight. Now, with his father's dignity and the department's integrity on the line, he was going to show them exactly what kind of chief they were dealing with. Michael pulled up to his father's house just as the sun was setting. James Cooper sat on the front porch, a cup of coffee in his hands, his Harley conspicuously absent from the driveway. The impound lot had lost the paperwork for its release. Another petty power play by Brady's crew. Brought you something, Michael said, climbing the porch steps and pulling out a manila envelope. Inside were photos of Brady and Morton leaving a nightclub together, taken by Chen's surveillance team. James studied the photos, his weathered face grave. How deep does it go? All the way to the commissioner, Michael replied, settling into the chair beside his father. The nightclubs, the protection racket, the evidence theft. It's all connected. They're using the department like their private security force. I had my suspicions, James nodded, taking a sip of coffee. That's why they targeted me. I've seen Brady's boys hanging around the clubs on my night rides, started taking notes, dates, license plates. Never thought they'd be bold enough to come after me directly. Michael turned sharply. You have records? In my shop safe. Been keeping a log for months. Something felt wrong about how they were patrolling, hassling certain businesses, but not others. The bike community talks. We notice patterns. A smile spread across Michael's face. Dad, that's exactly what we need. Your records could corroborate our witness statements, show the pattern of harassment. James set down his coffee cup, his eyes meeting his son's. Using my arrest against them? They thought targeting you would shut me down, Michael replied. Instead, they gave us the leverage to expose everything. But, he hesitated, it could be dangerous. These people have serious connections. James laughed, the sound both warm and determined. Son, I've been riding motorcycles for 40 years. Danger and I are old friends. Besides, his expression grew serious, your mother raised us both to stand up to bullies. She'd expect nothing less. The mention of Sarah Cooper hung between them. For a moment, her memory strengthening their resolve. She'd been the moral compass of the family, teaching Michael about justice while James taught him about courage. I need you to tell me everything, Michael said finally. Every detail about the arrest, every interaction you've had with these officers. We're building a case that goes beyond just police corruption. For the next hour, James laid out his observations. The patterns of police harassment at certain businesses, the protection offered to Morton's clubs, the way Brady's officers seemed to know exactly when to show up and when to look the other way. His detailed notes would provide the timeline they needed. There's something else, James added, standing up. Come with me. In his garage, James opened a locked cabinet, revealing dozens of mounted cameras. I installed security systems for half the businesses in the bike community, including some near Morton's clubs, been keeping the footage backed up just in case. Michael stared at the recordings in amazement. His father hadn't just been a victim. He'd been gathering evidence all along. Dad, this is insurance, James finished. Never trusted those officers, the way they strutted around like they owned the streets. Now we know why. Michael pulled out his phone, texting Chen about the new evidence. We'll need to move fast. Once we start collecting these recordings, they'll know we have them, James nodded. I'm ready. Question is, are you? Taking down the commissioner won't make you popular with City Hall. Michael's expression hardened. They stopped thinking about popularity when they put you in handcuffs. This isn't about politics anymore. It's about right and wrong. James gripped his son's shoulder, pride evident in his eyes. Your mother would be proud. You're not just enforcing the law, you're standing up for what it should be. As they stepped back onto the porch, a patrol car cruised by slowly. Brady's men keeping watch. Father and son watched it pass, neither showing any sign of concern. They think they're intimidating us, James observed. Let them watch, Michael replied. They have no idea what's coming. The night settled around them, but both men knew sleep would be long in coming. Tomorrow would begin the careful process of collecting James's evidence, building their case. Stronger, with each new piece. The corrupt officers had thought arresting James Cooper would silence his son. Instead, they'd armed him with everything he needed to bring them down. One more thing, James said, as Michael prepared to leave. When this is over, I want my bike back. Michael smiled. We'll get it back, Dad, and we'll get justice too. Lieutenant Brady paced the back room of Morton's flagship nightclub, his face flushed with anger. Around him sat his most trusted officers, Reeves, Sullivan, and 4 others who'd been part of their operation from the start. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Cooper's got surveillance teams watching everything. Brady spat. Chen's been pulling financial records, Hayes is documenting patrol patterns, and that rat in evidence is auditing every case we've touched. We need to shut this down, Reeves insisted, nervously drumming his fingers on the table. The old man's got cameras all over the district. If Cooper gets those recordings, he won't, Morton interrupted, entering the room with 2 of his security men. The club owner's expensive suit contrasted sharply with the officers' uniforms, but his expression held the same worried anger. My people are ready. One word and those cameras have unfortunate accidents. Sullivan shook his head. Cooper's too smart for that. He'll expect us to target the cameras. He's probably already getting the footage. Then we target him. Brady said, his voice cold. Everyone has pressure points. The commissioner's already making calls, putting heat on the mayor's office about Cooper's aggressive investigation tactics and harassment of veteran officers. One of the other officers, Martinez, spoke up. What about internal affairs? I've got dirt on Johnson that could slow down their investigation. Not good enough, Morton cut in. My brother-in-law's position is at risk. If this gets traced back to him, he left the threat hanging. Brady's phone buzzed. A text from his wife on the licensing board. Cooper's team just subpoenaed our licensing records. They're following the money. Destroy everything, Morton ordered. All the payment records, the security contracts, everything. Too late, Brady grimaced. They already have copies. Chen's been 10 steps ahead of us. We need to discredit Cooper before he can build his case. Reeves leaned forward. What about the media? We've got friends at the Tribune. We could leak stories about Cooper's vendetta against honest officers. Make it look personal because of his father. Do it, Brady nodded, and get our union reps involved. I want protests, press conferences, the whole circus. Paint Cooper as an out-of-control reformer, destroying department morale. Morton poured himself a drink, his hands slightly unsteady. My clubs are losing business. Your boy's protection doesn't mean much if Cooper's got eyes on every corner. He's just one man, Brady insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. One man with a badge, a grudge, and his father's evidence, Sullivan countered. We should have been more careful. That arrest was sloppy. It's not just Cooper, another officer added. The rank and file are turning. Too many are coming forward, offering statements, the blue walls cracking. Brady slammed his hand on the table. Then we plug the leaks. Anyone cooperating with Cooper's investigation suddenly finds themselves responding to calls alone. No backup, no support. That's dangerous territory, Martinez warned. If anything happens to a cooperating officer, then they should have kept their mouths shut, Brady snapped. We've spent years building this operation. I'm not letting some Boy Scout chief and his grease monkey father tear it down. Morton's phone chimed. The news made his face go pale. Cooper's team just raided one of my warehouses. They found the missing evidence. Drugs, guns, everything we've been holding for disposal. The room erupted in panic. Years of carefully stolen evidence, stored for resale, now in Cooper's hands. The paper trail would lead straight back to them. That's it, Brady decided, his voice hard. No more playing nice. Morton, call your brother-in-law. Tell him if he doesn't shut Cooper down, we start talking about his involvement. Everyone else, send the word. Anyone helping Cooper's investigation becomes a target. We've got dirt on half the department. Time to use it. As the corrupt officers dispersed into the night, none of them noticed the small red light blinking in the vintage motorcycle mirror mounted on the wall. One of James Cooper's cameras, capturing every word of their desperate planning. In their panic to save themselves, they were only building a stronger case against them. But desperate men make desperate choices, and the worst was yet to come. Detective Chen burst into Michael's office without knocking, her face flushed with urgency. Chief, you need to see this now. She placed her laptop on his desk, pulling up a video file. This just came from your father's surveillance system. The footage showed Commissioner Wallace himself entering Morton's club through a back entrance, his face partially hidden under an expensive fedora. But it wasn't just a casual visit. He was carrying a briefcase, and the timestamp showed 3 a.m. Well, after legal operating hours. There's more, Chen said, switching to another feed. This one showed the commissioner in the club's back room, briefcase open, stacks of cash being counted. Morton, Brady, and several other figures moved in and out of frame, their body language showing clear deference to Wallace. Michael leaned back, his mind racing. How long has this been going on? Your father's cameras caught similar meetings every third Thursday for the past 6 months. But here's where it gets interesting. Chen pulled up financial records. Those meetings coincide exactly with spikes in narcotics arrests by Brady's team. Arrests where the evidence mysteriously disappeared. They're not just protecting Morton's operation, Michael realized, the pieces clicking into place. The commissioner is running it. A knock at the door interrupted them. Officer Hayes entered, his face grave. Chief, you're going to want to hear this. He played an audio recording from his phone. Wallace's voice, clear and unmistakable. Cooper's father was a message. If he doesn't back off, next time it won't be just an arrest. Accidents happen in this city all the time. Michael's blood ran cold. This wasn't just corruption. It was a criminal enterprise run from the top of the department itself. The commissioner wasn't just covering for corrupt officers, he was their boss. There's something else, Hayes added hesitantly. We found old case files going back 15 years. Remember Sarah Martinez's drug task force that was ambushed? The one where 4 officers died? Michael nodded. It had been one of the department's darkest days. The tip that led them into that ambush. It came from Wallace's office. They were getting too close to his operation, even back then. The revelation hit Michael like a physical blow. Wallace hadn't just corrupted the department. He'd been willing to sacrifice his own officers to protect his criminal empire. His phone buzzed. A text from his father. Shop broken into. All cameras destroyed. They're making their move. But James had outsmarted them again. The real surveillance hub was hidden in his home's basement, the cameras transmitting to a secure cloud server. The shop break-in was too late. Chief, Chen said quietly, there's one more thing you need to see. She pulled up an old personnel file, Michael's mother's records, from when she worked as a civilian administrator in the department's finance office. 2 weeks before her accidental car crash, she filed this. Chen pointed to a report questioning unusual patterns in asset forfeiture accounts. Accounts that now, 15 years later, they knew were part of Wallace's operation. Michael's hands gripped his desk, knuckles white. My mother was investigating them, Chen confirmed softly, and Wallace couldn't let that happen. The office fell silent as the full weight of the revelation settled over them. This wasn't just about corruption anymore. This wasn't even just about his father's false arrest. This was about a decades-long criminal enterprise that had killed, to protect itself, reaching all the way to Michael's own family. Get me everything, he ordered, his voice steel. Every file, every recording, every piece of evidence we have. And contact the FBI. This just went beyond department corruption. As his team hurried to comply, Michael stared at the photo on his wall, him and his parents at his academy graduation. His mother's proud smile, now haunting in light of what he'd learned. Wallace hadn't just corrupted the department, he'd taken Michael's mother from him. The commissioner had made this personal long before Michael even knew he was fighting him. Now it was time to end it. Not just for his father, not just for the department, but for every officer and civilian who'd been sacrificed to protect Wallace's criminal empire. His phone buzzed again. Wallace requesting an immediate meeting to discuss department morale. Michael smiled grimly. Let the commissioner think he still held the cards. The truth was already unraveling his carefully constructed world of corruption and murder. The next move would be Wallace's. But for the first time, Michael held the advantage. The commissioner didn't realize it yet, but his reign was about to end. The FBI's temporary command center buzzed with activity inside the secure conference room of a downtown hotel. Special Agent Diana Reyes studied the evidence wall, now expanded to cover 3 times its original size. Every piece of corruption, every connection, every crime carefully documented and cross-referenced. Your father's surveillance network is incredible, she told Michael, reviewing the footage from Morton's clubs. He basically mapped the entire criminal enterprise without them knowing. Michael nodded, proud but worried. They know now. They've already tried to destroy the evidence. Too late, Chen interjected, entering with another stack of files. We've got multiple backups, and the FBI's cyber team has secured the cloud server. Everything's safe. Agent Reyes pointed to a timeline they'd constructed. The pattern is clear. Wallace took control of the department's asset forfeiture program 15 years ago. Since then, seized drugs and weapons regularly disappeared from evidence, only to resurface in Morton's territory. And anyone who got close to the truth? Michael's voice was tight. Transferred, discredited, or worse, Chen confirmed, pulling up a list of suspicious incidents. Your mother wasn't the only one, Chief. We've identified 12 suspicious deaths connected to investigations that threatened Wallace's operation. Hayes burst in, waving a thumb drive. Got it. Morton's accountant rolled. Full financial records. Offshore accounts, everything. Wallace has been laundering millions through a network of shell companies. The evidence was overwhelming. Vehicle seizures that never made it to auction, drug busts where only a fraction of the narcotics reached the evidence room, protection money from legitimate businesses forced to hire Morton's security companies. What? About the union? Michael asked. They're fracturing, Chen reported. Once we showed them the evidence about the ambushed drug task force, most of the old guard turned. Brady's support is crumbling. Agent Reyes nodded approvingly. You've built a solid RICO case. Corruption, drug trafficking, money laundering, murder. Wallace's whole empire is exposed. Michael studied the photos of his mother's car crash, now clearly no accident. We need to move fast. Wallace is planning something. Already seeing it, Hayes added. Brady's team is shredding files, intimidating witnesses. They're in panic mode. Let them panic, Agent Reyes said firmly. Every desperate move just adds to our evidence. We've got surveillance on all of them. Michael's phone lit up with a text from his father. Morton's men just tried to access my home security system. They failed. They're getting sloppy, Chen observed. A month ago, they were untouchable. Now they're making amateur mistakes. The team worked through the evidence methodically, building an airtight case. Financial records confirmed Wallace's corruption. Surveillance footage proved his direct involvement. Witness statements corroborated the pattern of intimidation and murder. One thing still bothers me, Michael said, staring at the timeline. Why now? Why target my father at this moment? Agent Reyes picked up a file. Because of this. Your reform proposals would have mandated regular audits of asset seizures. You were about to expose their whole operation without even knowing it existed. It made sense. Wallace had acted out of fear, using Brady's crew to send a message. Instead, they'd exposed themselves to exactly the kind of investigation they'd hoped to prevent. We're ready, Agent Reyes announced, closing her file. Grand jury indictments for Wallace, Morton, Brady, and 32 others. Multiple RICO charges, murder, corruption, the whole organization. Michael looked at his team. Chen's determination, Hayes's loyalty, the FBI's professionalism. They'd built a case that would tear down not just a few corrupt officers, but an entire criminal empire masquerading as law enforcement. Tomorrow morning, he decided, we move at dawn. The police station hummed with barely contained chaos. Officers clustered in small groups, conversations dropping to whispers when others passed. Brady's remaining loyalists gathered in one corner of the break room, while reform-minded officers claimed another. The divide was no longer subtle. It was a visible line drawn through the heart of the department. They're shredding documents in Brady's office, Officer Thompson whispered to Chen as she passed. Been at it all night. Let them, Chen replied quietly. We already have copies of everything. They're just adding destruction of evidence to their charges. In the locker room, tensions finally boiled over. Sullivan shoved Hayes against a wall, his face red with rage. You're a rat, Hayes. You and all the others helping Cooper tear down good officers. Good officers? Hayes laughed bitterly, standing his ground. You helped murder Sarah Martinez's entire task force. We found the proof. The color drained from Sullivan's face as other officers turned to stare. The rumor had been spreading, but this was the first public accusation. That's a lie, Brady barked, entering the room. Wallace would never... He stopped short, realizing his mistake. Nobody had mentioned Wallace's involvement. The commissioner himself remained in his office, making calls to political allies who suddenly couldn't be reached. His secretary watched through the glass as he grew more desperate with each unanswered phone. You don't understand, Brady tried rallying his supporters in the parking lot. Cooper's going to destroy everything we've built. You mean everything you've stolen? A veteran sergeant interrupted. We've seen the evidence, Jack. The drugs you resold, the bribes, the murders, it's over. More officers were coming forward hourly, sharing stories of corruption they'd witnessed. The dam had broken, and years of pent-up truth were flooding out. Michael, watched from his office as Brady's crew grew more isolated. Their threats of retaliation now fell on deaf ears. Even officers who hadn't joined the investigation were turning their backs on the corrupt leadership. "Chief," Chen entered with an update. "Wallace just tried accessing the offshore accounts. FBI cyber team blocked him. He's getting desperate." A crash echoed from the evidence room. Sullivan had flipped a desk, screaming about betrayal. Two officers immediately drew their weapons, unsure if he was armed. "Stand down!" Michael's voice cut through the chaos. The authority in his tone froze everyone in place. "Anyone who can't maintain professionalism can leave now. Otherwise, get back to work." Sullivan stormed out, followed by a handful of Brady's loyalists. They all knew what was coming. The only question was who would be left standing when it was over. Wallace's secretary appeared at Michael's door. "Sir, the commissioner wants to meet, says it's urgent." "I bet he does," Michael replied coolly. "Tell him I'm busy building a case." The message was clear. The old power structure was crumbling. Officers who had once feared Brady's crew now openly defied them. Those who had stayed silent about corruption now spoke freely. "It's like watching a palace coup," Agent Reyes observed, standing beside Michael at his window. Below, Brady was having a heated argument with his former supporters, more like watching justice finally catch up. Michael corrected her. 15 years of corruption coming to an end. His phone buzzed, a text from his father. Morton's security just abandoned their posts at his clubs, rats fleeing the ship. The sun was setting on the old guard's reign. By morning, everything would change. The only question was how many would try to fight the inevitable. Michael gathered his trusted officers for final instructions. Tomorrow would determine the future of the department. Tonight, the lines were drawn between those who served justice and those who had betrayed it. The internal war was ending. The real battle was about to begin. Dawn broke over Chicago as FBI tactical teams took their positions. Michael stood in the command center, watching multiple screens showing live feeds from around the city. Each target location was marked on a digital map. Morton's clubs, Brady's house, Wallace's office, and a dozen other sites where evidence and suspects would be found. "All teams in position," Agent Reyes confirmed, her voice tight with pre-operation tension. "Ready on your signal." Michael checked his watch. In precisely 3 minutes, synchronized raids would begin across the city. Brady's crew had been under surveillance all night, most of them holed up in Morton's main club, probably destroying evidence and planning their response. 60 seconds, Chen announced, monitoring the radio channels. She'd coordinated with trusted dispatch officers to ensure no warnings would reach the targets. Hayes burst in. "Chief, Wallace just entered the building. He's heading to his office." Perfect timing. The commissioner had walked right into their trap, probably hoping to destroy final evidence before the workday began. "All teams, execute," Michael commanded. The screens erupted with activity. FBI teams breached Morton's clubs simultaneously, catching the corrupt officers mid-shred. At Brady's house, agents secured computers and files. Wallace's private residence was already being searched. "Morton's in custody," Reyes reported. "Caught him trying to access his safe room. Brady and 5 others arrested at the main club." Michael headed for Wallace's office, Chen and Hayes flanking him. They could hear commotion throughout the building as FBI agents secured evidence and detained suspects. "It's over, Commissioner," Michael announced, entering Wallace's office with his weapon drawn. The older man stood by his desk, face ashen, a USB drive in his hand. "You have no idea what you're doing, Cooper," Wallace snarled, but his voice trembled. "The people I know, the connections I have, are running for cover," Michael finished. "We have everything. The murders, the drug trafficking, Mom's investigation, all of it." Wallace's eyes widened at the mention of Michael's mother. "You can't prove—" "Actually, we can," Chen interrupted, displaying a warrant. "Your private server makes for interesting reading, including emails about dealing with problematic internal investigations." FBI agents entered, cuffing the commissioner as Michael read him his rights. The mighty had fallen, and the whole department was watching. "Sir," Hayes called from the doorway, "you need to see this." The screens in the command center showed the full scope of the operation. 38 arrests in progress. Evidence teams securing documents, computers, and recordings. Morton's criminal empire crumbling in real time. Reeves and Sullivan are barricaded in one of the clubs, Reyes reported. SWATs moving in. Michael watched as the last pieces of corruption were swept away. The department would need rebuilding, but at least now it could be done right. His phone buzzed. A message from his father. "Just saw Wallace in cuffs on the news. Your mother would be proud, son." The sun had fully risen now, marking the dawn of a new era for Chicago law enforcement. The old guard's reign of corruption was ending, not with a bang, but with the quiet click of handcuffs. Reeves and Sullivan had barricaded themselves in Morton's flagship club, taking 2 evidence technicians hostage. The situation had transformed from an arrest operation into a crisis, with SWAT teams surrounding the building and news helicopters circling overhead. "Let me talk to them," Michael insisted, strapping on a vest as Agent Reyes objected. "Chief, they're cornered and desperate. They know they're facing life sentences. Exactly why they might listen. They worked for me, followed my orders. Maybe they'll follow one more." Michael approached the club's entrance, hands visible, Chen and Hayes covering him from defensive positions. "Reeves, Sullivan," he called out, "you know this only ends one way. Don't add more charges to what you're already facing." Sullivan's voice crackled over a stolen radio. "Easy for you to say, Cooper. You've got no idea what Wallace will do to us in prison if we surrender." "Wallace isn't going to do anything to anyone," Michael replied. "We found his hitman list, the one with my mother's name on it. He's never getting out." A moment of silence followed. Michael could almost hear them processing this information. "How?" Reeves's voice wavered. "How many deaths are on that list?" 12, Michael answered, "including 4 officers from the Martinez task force. You helped make that happen, Reeves. Time to decide if you want to add 2 more names today." Inside the club, the 2 officers looked at each other. Their world was collapsing around them, 15 years of corruption exposed in a single morning. "The hostages," Chen called out. "Let them go, and we talk about witness protection. You know things Wallace and Morton would kill to keep quiet." The club's door opened slightly, and the 2 evidence technicians emerged, shaken but unharmed. "SWAT teams quickly moved them to safety." "Coming out," Sullivan finally called. "Don't shoot." The 2 officers emerged with their hands up, faces pale with resignation. As they were cuffed and led away, Michael saw not hardened criminals, but broken men who'd lost their way years ago. "Chief!" Hayes rushed up. "Brady's trying to make a deal. Says he has recordings of every conversation with Wallace about the operation." "Of course he does," Michael nodded. "Insurance policy, get him to the FBI." The morning's operation had netted 43 arrests, including Wallace, Morton, and their entire network. Evidence teams were uncovering decades of corruption, each new discovery validating the scale of their investigation. At the station, Michael watched as Brady was led past Wallace's office. The 2 men locked eyes briefly, years of criminal partnership ending in mutual betrayal. "Sir," Chen appeared with an evidence bag. "Found this in Wallace's private safe. Your mother's original report about the missing funds. He kept it as a trophy." Michael took the bag, his mother's signature clearly visible on the document that had cost her life. "Make sure this is logged properly, everything by the book." News crews gathered outside as the scale of the operation became public. Chicago's biggest police corruption scandal was breaking, and at its center was a story of murder, justice, and a son's 15-year journey to uncover the truth. Agent Reyes approached with a satisfied smile. "Your father's surveillance footage sealed it. Wallace's lawyer is already talking plea deal. Nobody wants this going to trial." Michael nodded, watching the last of the corrupt officers being processed. The department would need rebuilding, but at least now it could be done right. His phone buzzed one final time. His father again. "Your bike's ready at the impound lot. Thought you might want to take a ride when this is done." The son reached its peak over Chicago as the last pieces of Wallace's empire fell. A new chapter was beginning for the department, built on the foundation of truth and justice that Michael's mother had died protecting. The corrupt officers had thought arresting James Cooper would silence his son. Instead, they triggered their own downfall, brought down by the very family they'd tried to destroy. The evening news led with aerial footage of the mass arrests. Breaking news, police commissioner, top officials arrested in massive corruption sting scrolled across screens throughout Chicago. Reporter cameras captured Wallace and Brady being led into the federal building in handcuffs, their faces ashen with defeat. Inside the station, Michael supervised the installation of new evidence tracking systems, while FBI teams continued cataloging seized documents. The corrupt officers' lockers were being cleared out, their badges and service weapons logged as evidence in what was becoming the largest police corruption case in Chicago's history. 43 arrests, 17 million in seized assets, and enough evidence to put Wallace away for 3 lifetimes, Agent Reyes summarized, reviewing the day's statistics. Plus, Brady's singing like a canary about every operation they ever ran. Chen appeared with the latest update from the DA's office. They're fast-tracking the indictments. No one wants to risk any delays that might let them wiggle out of this. The mayor had already scheduled a press conference, distancing himself from Wallace and promising full cooperation with federal authorities. The political fallout was just beginning, but Michael's focus remained on rebuilding his department. What matters now, he told his assembled officers, is restoring the public's trust. We do that one day at a time, with honesty, integrity, and transparency. As night fell over Chicago, the city buzzed with the news of how a son's quest for justice had exposed decades of corruption, turning a simple false arrest into the catalyst that cleaned up the entire department. 1 month after the arrests, the changes in the Chicago Police Department were already visible. The old guard's offices had been transformed into a transparency center where citizens could easily file complaints or review department policies. Every arrest was now documented with multiple body cameras, and evidence processing included triple verification protocols. Michael had promoted Chen to lieutenant, placing her in charge of the new Internal Affairs Division. Hayes led a community outreach program, rebuilding trust between officers and the neighborhoods they served. The blue wall of silence had been replaced by a culture of accountability. James Cooper's motorcycle shop had become an unofficial gathering place for officers and citizens alike, a symbol of the bridge being built between law enforcement and the community. His security camera network now officially collaborated with the department, creating a model for community police partnership. The FBI's final report confirmed what they'd suspected. Wallace's corruption had cost 9 lives and allowed millions in drugs to flow through Chicago's streets. But now, with new leadership and reform procedures, the department was becoming what it should have been all along, a force for justice rather than a tool of corruption. As Michael watched a new class of recruits being sworn in, he knew the department's darkest chapter had finally closed, and a new era of ethical policing had begun. 6 months after the arrests that shook Chicago's law enforcement to its core, Michael Cooper stood beside his father's restored Harley Davidson at the annual Police Community Festival. The bike gleamed in the summer sun, its blue pinstripes matching the department's new community outreach vehicles. Wallace's trial had ended in multiple life sentences. Justice finally served for the families of all his victims. Brady and the other officers had taken plea deals, their testimonies ensuring no part of the corruption remained hidden. Morton's criminal empire had been dismantled, his clubs now transformed into community centers. James Cooper had accepted a position as civilian advisor to the department's ethics committee, his experience and integrity helping shape the next generation of officers. His shop continued to serve as a bridge between law enforcement and the community, a living symbol of how trust could be rebuilt. "Your mother would be proud," James told his son, watching new recruits interact with neighborhood residents. "Not just of taking them down, but of what you've built in their place." Michael nodded, knowing that his mother's death had not been in vain. Her pursuit of truth had planted the seeds of reform that her son had finally brought to fruition. The department she'd died trying to protect had become the department she'd always believed it could be. The future of Chicago law enforcement was bright, built on a foundation of transparency, accountability, and trust, proof that sometimes justice comes full circle.